All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Alper. I'm the Education Content Manager for this year's CodeDay Labs. I'm happy to welcome Omar, who will be talking to you guys about navigating jobs and finding jobs in the US as an international student. So, Omar, if you'd like to introduce yourself a little more, and then we can get started.
Thank you, Alper. I'll actually start just by sharing my screen here. Yeah, so a little about me to start with. I am a graphics engineer working at Snapchat at the moment, work on the map. I graduated from St. Olaf College in 2018. I did a computer science and math degree, and I went there as an international student. So I grew up in Egypt, in Alexandria, and I came to the US for undergrad for college in like 2014. And have been working in the US since then. And you can learn more about me or you can reach out or see my work on my website here, omarshehata.me. So this is going to be kind of a short talk because it's mostly just going to be about my specific like personal journey working in the US. And it's mostly like, here's a bunch of stuff that I wish I had known when I first started doing, looking for jobs and negotiating and things like that. So that's kind of the takeaway that I hope you get from this. And then because it's kind of a short talk, so if you have questions about any of these things or just about advice in general, feel free to put that in the Q&A, and then I have that on my second screen here. So I'll be taking a look at that as we talk. But these are kind of some of the things that I'll be covering here, because essentially my timeline was started in the US as an F1 student on an F1 visa, and then worked, did a few internships. So that was using the CPT during the school year and during the summers while still in college. And then after graduating, I worked on OPT and then did the STEM extension. So I was able to work for 3 years on that student visa. And then I was able, eventually after that transition to an H-1B, and now I'm in the process of a green card sponsorship. So that's kind of my rough timeline. Those are kind of things I have a personal experience just navigating from just a perspective of one person. So I think one of the big things that I never was always kind of a little frazzled by, I didn't know how to answer, was this question that you'll get this in a lot of like almost any job application is, will you now or in the future require visa sponsorship? And one of the things that I didn't realize about this is that depending on what your situation is, you don't always have to answer yes to this, because for example, if you are well, I guess let me put it this way, like from the perspective of the employer, a lot of times what they're trying to do here is they're trying to filter out applicants who may need like a work visa in order to start working. And the reason they want to filter that is because for people who are not currently in the US, getting that, they often have to wait, it could be like more than 6 months to wait to apply, and then they may not get that. And so having to fill that role could be very long. But for you as a student who's already in the US, you already have authorization to start work essentially immediately, right? Whether you're able to work on like CPT if you're still in college, or on OPT if you just graduated. So technically the answer is you don't need sponsorship to start working. And so, but it's a little tricky, right? Because they put this like, will you in the future require sponsorship? And the answer is like technically yes, because after 3 years your OPT will expire. But you also may not be at the company after 3 years. And it's actually pretty, like the average, I think, these days, and especially for big tech companies, is around 3 years or maybe even less. So for all intents and purposes, and a lot of times like this question is just like a initial filter, like nobody actually looks at it. So a lot of times it's perfectly fine to say, no, you don't need sponsorship. And that's not like lying, because again, you have the authorization needed to start work immediately without any additional like sponsorship or anything they can do. So that's really important to keep in mind, because a lot of times you may get filtered out before even talking to a human being. And a lot of times when you do eventually talk to them and you explain the situation that you are an OPT student, or like you're an F1 student, which means you can work, and you have these 3 years where you can work. And there's not a lot of extra work they actually have to do on their end as a company. Then they understand that and they're like, oh, okay. A lot of times they actually didn't realize this, especially if they're smaller companies. So this is like a pretty big, I think, tip or something that I didn't know about until I started like actually talking to people at the companies and seeing who makes these decisions often, because they don't actually understand how the process works, which is a good segue for my second point here. Is it's really important for you to understand how the process works, not just what you need to do, but also what the company is supposed to do. Because like I said, a lot of times they don't know, and to them sometimes they think like hiring someone who's not on an H-1B visa, on a work visa from outside the country is just as hard as hiring someone who's a student who happens to be not a citizen, and that's definitely not the case. So it's important for you to be able to explain, you know, what the process actually involves and what they would need to do and what the cost might be to them as well. Yeah, because in terms of OPT, there's actually almost nothing the employer needs to do other than like sign a couple of documents. It's like a form that you're mostly filling out yourself anyway. So there really should be no reason to turn down an OPT student, an F1 student based on that. Oh, and then the other big thing here is talking to a lawyer is always helpful. Like I mentioned in one of the earlier slides, like talking to your DSO, who's a designated school official. That'll be like the first resource you should always talk to. There should be someone at your school who, you know, the person who signs your documents, immigration documents specifically. They're the best person to talk to about this, but also it may be helpful to understand, like, you know, given your particular situation, like, you know, depending on you know, where you grew up and what your goal is, it may be helpful to talk to a lawyer. And this isn't as scary as it sounds. I mean, it does sound scary, but I've found it easy, at least on this website, upcounsel.com. That's just one I've had good luck with. It's mostly like a website where you can post like here's a need you have, like why you need to talk to a lawyer, and they'll kind of like essentially try to match you up with lawyers in who are qualified to do the thing that you were looking for. And you'll get a range of like prices too, which is important, right? Like if you don't, especially if you're just graduating, you don't have a lot of money to spend on something like this, you'll be able to see how much how much it would cost before you engage with the lawyer. And this is also a good segue into understanding the contracts that you sign, the employer agreement, which often there'll be a contract when you start any job. Most of the time you'll have this contract that you're signing. And you know, I used to treat these, I think a lot of people treat these like the terms of service that, you know, you kind of scroll through and you don't need to read it. Sorry. But it definitely shouldn't be treated that way, because it is a legally binding thing that will affect you. And an important part here is that a lot of contracts like aren't set in stone. Like you can always change a contract before signing it, even if some companies say like, oh, we have the standard thing, we don't really change it, but that's often like not really true, because, you know, it can always be changed. Like a couple of things like to look out for is like the biggest one is probably let's see, this one in the like the third point, this ownership of work. Most employer agreements will say something like any work that you do is owned by the company, generally speaking. And so some of them can be a bit more specific. Like some of them will say any work that you do on company time using company hardware will be owned by a company. Others might say something more broad, like any work that you do, period. And the reason they do this is because without such a contract, anything you do by default is owned by you, is copyrighted to you. And so like in theory, you could work for a company for a year and then sue them because they use your work without permission. So there has to be like a transfer of ownership of the intellectual work that you're creating to the company. And so oftentimes that'll be in the employer agreement that says like, you're being hired, given this money in exchange for giving them the rights to your work. The reason I mentioned it here is because it's important for us, especially working in tech, to kind of have a separation between the work that you're giving up for the company and the work that you might to keep yourself. Like, for example, you have side projects you're doing, or you're working on something that like an app that you might want to release at some point, and maybe you'll make some money from that, or like something else that could become a company that you can start. So it's important to kind of carve out, like oftentimes if you see something that says any work that you create period is owned by the company, you can always ask them like, hey, can we just add like any work that I create on company time or that's related to the company business, etc. And there's no good reason they would say no to that. But it's always something like you should, I think it's worth arguing for. The other big thing is a lot of times these same kind of contracts will have a prior inventions list where you list anything you've invented that will remain owned by you. And I used to see that as like, oh, if I haven't like invented anything, I don't have any patents, so I always leave that blank. But that doesn't actually specifically mean just inventions. It's really anything that you want ownership of. So again, if you've made like an app or any really a website, a game, any piece of work that you've done in the past that you want to make it clear that this is stuff that's owned by you and will continue to be owned by you. Maybe especially if it's something you want to continue working on, you should definitely list it here, and it'll be on paper that that's owned by you. Yeah, and then another important thing is being aware of like most of these contracts will be what's called at will employment. So they might say something like, they want you to give like 2 weeks of notice if you're quitting, or 4 weeks of notice or something like that. But a lot of times that's not actually something they can require. Like the contract may say that, but it's not something. There's still not going to be any legal ramifications for you to not do that. It's like a nice thing to do to tell them when you're quitting, and or come transitioning or something. But it's just important to be aware of like what your legal obligations are and what your rights are here. Because generally what at will employment means is that you can be fired for any reason without them having to give you any heads up. But also the reverse is true. You can quit for any reason without giving them a heads up. So that's generally what that means. But again, this is all things that I didn't understand until like talking to the lawyer. Like oftentimes having a lawyer review your employer agreement before you sign it is a good idea if you can afford it. Like I think the cheapest would be between like $200 to $300 to get a lawyer to like just look at it, especially if it's only a couple pages, and just explain to you what is you're signing for and what is something you can maybe negotiate as well. All right, here's another tip that I think would have helped me a lot. So on one hand, if you are graduating from a college in the US, you have the nice thing is that you can work on OPT for a year, and if you're working in STEM, if you're working in tech, you get an extra 2 years. So you have 3 years of total work on your OPT. So that's nice in that you don't have to worry about work visas for a while. But it's also really important to start applying for the work visas as early as you can, because there isn't a guarantee that once you apply that you'll get it. So like my mistake was sort of being like, oh, I have like 3 years, so maybe like it's not a big deal. I don't want to ask for this early on, and then maybe when I really need it, I'll ask the company for it or start to bring it up. But it's definitely a mistake because if you can bring it up early, maybe they say no at first, that gives you extra time for you to be like, well, what about next year, and then maybe have another chance then. Because what I did was I asked them in my second year, and they were like, well, no, but maybe next year. And so I should have just started that a little earlier. Yeah, and I've also had friends who have even actually starting it pretty early, but then they missed it the first year and they missed it the second year. So it was kind of cutting it really close. So yeah, there's no reason not to try to apply for that early on. Yeah, and I was kind of mentioning this before, like understanding what the process is like on on the employer side is important because it would have helped me with the negotiation, because here, when I first brought it up, they were like, oh, I think this cost like $50,000. So, this is going to be a big deal for us. It was a small company. And so that was their justification for deferring it. But I later learned, again, after talking to a lawyer, that it's actually much cheaper than that. I think, I don't remember now, and I'm sure it changes maybe. But, it was actually like something like 10,000 or less for doing this particular process for me at the time. So understanding that actually changed the equation a lot, because now it's actually like a small part of your salary, and maybe you can negotiate it as sort of part of that. So I think that's important to understand when you're negotiating. Yeah, and then the other part is if you're negotiating for like a permanent residency, like a green card, you can think of it as like one tip they give you when negotiating for salaries in general is that the dollar amount isn't the only thing you're negotiating for. Like maybe you'll ask for like a raise and then you'll get denied for that, but then you can negotiate for something else. Like, well, if I can't get this raise, what about like more vacation time, or flexible, just more flexible hours or something like that. So the green card can be kind of something like that, where like you could come in like asking for a raise, but then like and I say this because it's like a negotiating tactic. Like you can, maybe they don't want to give a raise, but you can sort of give up that extra raise in exchange for them doing this green card, which could feel like a win-win. Like, the company gets to save this money, or like they don't have to give a raise right now, but then they have to do this other thing. So that's like how I would frame it, and I think that's a good way to think about it too. This is generally good advice. It helps a lot to keep good records, especially when you're applying from like transitioning from like an OPT to an H-1B. There's often a lot of these things like they need to see like pay stubs. That's like one thing that I often will not have necessarily kept. But this is like proof that you've worked at a company, that you've gotten paid this much. This helps a lot, I think, when you're applying for a work visa, when you're transitioning from OPT to H-1B. And let's say you've done a bunch of internships, you should definitely save like pay stubs from those as proof that you've worked at those companies. Here's kind of a little maybe lesser known thing that I definitely wasn't aware of. I think would have maybe changed my how I'm looking for jobs. But unlike private companies, universities don't have a cap on work visas. And this is kind of a big deal, because it means like, even if a company wants to sponsor you, they might do that, and then you might still not get it. Whereas a university wouldn't have that problem. So like, there's obviously less software jobs in there, but you might have seen like software jobs in like a research lab or something. And that would have the advantage of it's almost like more guaranteed if they sponsor you, that you'll like get it. So yeah, because I think at one point I had a job from like a private company, a job from a university, and university one was paying less, and it was actually like a short-term, like a 1 or 2 year contract. And so it seemed like obviously the company one was better, but then like in retrospect, it might have been easier to get a work visa through that. And of course, it's something you should ask for before you sign the offer, just to see what their intentions are. Because even though universities essentially can give out an H-1B to anyone, they don't. Some of them can be more reluctant to. Like I think some of them just do it more for academic positions and not for like software engineering positions. But that's, I think, worth knowing too. Another important thing to remember here is that while you're on when you're on OPT, when you graduate in those 3 years, you have much more flexibility in terms of the kind of work you can do than when you switch to H-1B. The big one is that having multiple jobs. And this was useful to me because, for example, in addition, like I had my main job, but then I enjoyed like sort of doing like teaching. It was like kind of like a coding bootcamp type of thing that I enjoyed doing, and it was like paid, and that was perfectly fine because it's still like under my degree. It's like teaching computer science, and it was definitely helpful for like my resume and stuff. And so it was pretty easy to do that. Whereas on H-1B, I can't do that anymore now that I've transitioned to that. And yeah, really anything else, any kind of like side work that you might do that would still be in your field. You can do that while OPT, but you can't when you transition. So that's important to keep in mind. And both of them you can switch jobs, but I think on H1B it's a little harder just because the company still has to like reapply for like a transfer. Like there isn't like a lottery or anything for the transfer. It's not like applying from scratch, but it just takes time. Like it could take like a month or so to do the transfer. Whereas I think OPT is just much faster. I think that's kind of just those are kind of the big things that I wish I knew. I mean, really the big thing is understanding the process for yourself allows you to make all these decisions, like, you know, how to answer their questions and make it so you don't get filtered out too early, and how to negotiate for it and everything. So yeah, and really, if nothing else you get out of this is like talk to your DSO and talk to a lawyer to make sure you understand everything and what the options are that are available to you. So that's kind of the just. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them here. You can also reach out to me. If you're putting them here in Zoom, you can put them in the Q&A in Zoom. Otherwise, thanks for coming, and hope this was helpful.
Thank you so much, Omar, for the amazing talk again. I hope it was as informative for the audience as it was for me just even sitting here. But if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask it in the Q&A. I will provide Omar's LinkedIn if that's okay with you, or email, so you can contact him, as I know sometimes those questions come up afterwards. So it seems like we don't have any questions for today. So thank you so much again, Omar. I hope you have a great day.
Of course, thank you, Alper. Bye.
Thank you. All right, have a great day, everyone.